Hello, my name's Matt. I'm an illustrator and a dungeon master, and I'm creating a world called Winter's Edge. For this episode, episode 4, I'll be getting into the city of Yore and giving a general overview and flavour of that city. So let's get into it. I'll be doing some artwork over the top and some fly-throughs in a 3D model I made of the city, just to get an idea of its different areas. I'll also be reading from a novel I've been writing just to grab certain paragraphs and extracts that I think demonstrate the world. Okay, thank you for watching, and let's get into it. Okay, so this is a quick mock-up I did in Blender for Yore. Blender's a free-to-use 3D software that can be picked up fairly quickly, especially if you just stick with cubes and cylinders and triangles. I use it to block out the city and give me a general idea of how everything works. Here we have the market square, the market area. These are the docks, basically run by the pirate lord Bowl, who manages this entire area and the criminal elements found within it. Got a little boat repairing yard here in the area known as the Boonies. This area here is the Scar, and this is where Carul marched his armies up onto the old school of magic here and destroyed the school, and now it's largely left alone as a cursed, untouched area. It used to be a magnificent school that overlooked Yore, and Yore was the shining pearl of the realm before it fell out of favour with the king and became its own independent city. Here is part of the old city where the want-to-be nobles still live, pretending to be nobles. They're basically wealthy shipping families that are holding on to the honour and prestige they had about 50 years ago. Yeah, so this is really handy. You can quickly make maps of the area. You can drill in to make more detailed maps of areas where players will be wanting to go. As you can see, here was going to be an area our players ended up at called Mulestop Lane. So I drilled down and created a more detailed map of that area so I could describe what they were seeing. Alleys are quite interesting, with houses built on top of houses, rickety old towers swaying in the wind, and a beautiful view out onto the horizon to distant lands. So that's Yore as a 3D model. Let's get into it as a narrative. With this novel I wrote a few years ago and constantly build upon. I'll read some excerpts out of it, which I think give the general flavour of Yore and some of its areas. Thank you. Yore is a lawless seaport shantytown, home to cutthroats and pirates. It takes a ruthless and resourceful person to survive in its salty streets and understand its unorthodox systems. It is basically run by two warring factions who are forced to play nice by a hidden, almost mythical third faction that watches over the city and enforces its own rules. Okay, this excerpt is from my novel, and it describes the general feeling of Yore, especially around the dock areas, from the perspective of Rue, a young Uday urchin. People seldom looked up in the shantytown of Yore. It was not a place for daydreamers. It was a place to keep your head down, watch your step, and hold your coins close. The crowded, narrow streets were a sea of people, a powerful tide that drew the eye. Merchants selling their wares, travellers searching for lodgings before night fell, sailors returning to their ships. People seldom looked up. Makeshift towers crowded the sky, haphazard structures that loomed at impossible angles. They swayed in the light sea breeze. Small cat-like creatures leapt between them, threatening to topple them. Far better to keep your eyes to the ground and concentrate on the more immediate dangers. The Kriska at your feet, the street urchins that eyed your coin purse, the hard men that tracked you with hard stares, the dark alleyways where shadowy figures lurked. No, people seldom looked up, and that's the way Rue liked it. This was where he ran free from the crowds and its dangers, where his feet moved in time with the swaying rooftops, and he glided over narrow pathways at dizzying heights. Rue was a fleeting figure of rags and bones. His skin was dark brown, his weary eyes almost golden amber. His hair was wild and thick, tied loosely at the back with frayed cloth. His features marked him as an Uday, a once proud race of plains people, now fallen and disgraced. He carried his people's love of open spaces, and out here he was above the sea-damp shadows and under the sun, running where the birds flew and the sky began. His leaps over the fog-filled alleyways set him free, if only for a moment. He landed lightly, as sure-footed as a cat, and followed a path of planks worn smooth by his footsteps. The Kriska were up here too. You couldn't escape them in Yore. Long-bodied and agile, with a cat-like face and huge ears, they were well suited to climbing the towers and could easily leap the huge distances between them. They knew Rue well and seemed to delight in running with the boy. Rue felt confident in their presence, like he was part of a pack. It sometimes felt as if the Chris King himself watched over the boy. Okay, so that was an excerpt. Now, apart from the rickety dock area, there's also the older city where wealthy shipping families live. It's known as the Nobles District. And this is another excerpt from the novel describing the Nobles District. Lady Poldark's estate lay in the northern quarter, as far away from the docks as possible. Hers was an old shipping family, made rich when Yore was the gateway to the realm. When the town fell outside the king's law, the Poldarks continued to run a trade empire, but dealt in more shadowy circles. The northern quarter still tried to retain a sense of old-world civilization as the rest of Yore fell into lawlessness. Rue knew it was a facade. The Poldarks were as corrupt as Pirate Bowl. Nevertheless, as he watched the cobbled streets from above, the difference was noticeable. The crowd had thinned and the merchants were gone. A large number of guards patrolled the streets, dressed in the Poldark colours of red and gold. There were other estates here, owned by a number of wealthy families pretending to be nobles, all with their own militia. Rue frowned. There were a lot of guards, far more than usual. There had been an assassination a week ago. An elder noble had been killed in his tower, and now the northern quarter was on high alert. Rue had actually delivered a package to the noble around that time. He vaguely remembered him as a tall and bearded man, and that he had tipped poorly. Rue suspected that the lady herself had the man assassinated in some political game these nobles liked to play. These extra guards were just for show, to avoid the attention of the Chris King. Okay, the next area we'll cover is the Scar, which is a corrupted area of Yore. It had been mentioned in episode 2. It is where a swath of corrupted magic destroyed half the city, and its effects still last to this day. The scene is Rue having to escape a gang and disappears into the Scar to hide from them. Rue moves silently through the collapsed cobbled streets. The fog grew thicker here. Everything was damp, the stone path slick with stale water, old awnings collapsed and rotting. Night was fast approaching, and he shivered as the shadows darkened. It was unnaturally quiet in this part of town. Most living things avoided it, a natural instinct at the wrongness of the place. Even the noise from the distant dock seemed reluctant to enter. An occasional hacking cough from some poor soul would echo off the broken buildings, all damaged and torn. Some structures were burned so badly that the stonework had melted. Magic was a distant memory to the people of Yore, banished long before Rue was born. As he stole through these cursed streets, he could see why. A primal fear shivered deep in his belly, a fear at the damage magic could do and the taint it could leave behind. He could still feel it here, crackling softly across the skin, pulling at the hairs of his arms. It was little wonder that it was banished, if it could do this to half a city. And another part we'll look at is the abandoned old school. It sits on a plateau overlooking the city of Yore, and most think it's cursed by the Chris King himself, who we'll get into in the next episode, and they avoid it. And this is an excerpt from Rue, who ignores the curse and actually lives in the ruins of the old school of magic. And he's talking to a strange doll-like totem that he has found. Rue lifted up his backpack. "You can come, but you have to hide in here. You're kind of forbidden." The doll tilted his head questioningly. "Well, all magic is forbidden, and your magic." The doll spread his palms. "Why?" "Because of that," said the boy, pointing at the ruins below, as the doll leapt up onto the balcony's stone wall. Rue then looked out at the old school, the broken towers and collapsed buildings. "And that! Magic did all of that, and much worse. There's a scar from here all the way to Roulon." Rue turned from the edge of the balcony. "You know about Carul?" At the mention of the name, the doll glanced up sharply. It nodded grimly. "You do? Were you there when he attacked?" The doll shook his head. It made several chopping gestures with his hands. "Oh, after. Well, this was his school, a school of magic, until he destroyed it with an army of iron giants, and then he marched on to the king. But the king beat him, and then forbade all magic. And he closed the school, even though it was already destroyed, and then he banished all the mages. He also crushed the Udai out on the plains, because, well, Karu was an Udai, like me, and because they still did magic and wouldn't stop. That was a long time ago, before I was born. But nobody but Kriska come up here. Everyone thinks it's cursed like the scar, but it's not." Okay, so that's a brief geography of Yore. And there's other areas to explore in the city as well. There's like the Cog, where all the taverns and bars are, a sort of central area for sailors. And Newtown, which is being developed by the Nobles District. Okay, so that's a brief geography of Yore, a bit of flavour for it. I'll get into more detail about the factions next episode. If you want to see some of my party and my campaign visiting Yore and experiencing it, check out episode 5 in my Adventures of Yore series. There's a playlist in my channel. And thank you for watching, and more to come. Cheers.